First, we would like to begin by acknowledging that UQAM is located on unceded indigenous lands. The Kaurna Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. As we are today connected with Kansas, James, I also have the acknowledgement for Kansas. Is this okay that I'm saying it? Yeah, you're fine with it? Okay. We acknowledge that the state is home to many indigenous nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. The name Kansas itself originates from the Kaw word kadze, meaning people of the south wind. Kansas is currently home for 4 federally recognized nations: the Prairie Brand Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. Sorry if my pronunciation is not the best one in English. So thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and a very special thanks to our invited speaker, James Yékú. Before presenting you, James, I wish to thank the CELAT-UQAM, the conference, the Research Center Culture, Art and Society, that was founded in 1944 and became an official center in 1975. It is one of the oldest research centers in Quebec. And it is now bringing together 3 different universities, l'Université Laval, l'Université du Québec à Montréal, et l'Université du Québec à Chicoutimi, and some other universities. And I want to thank the CELAT for supporting the conference today. I welcome also very much the brilliant and curious students from the media school at UQAM who just said hello to you earlier and who started their first year in production strategy, immersive media, television and film production, as well as other curious listeners who joined for the conference today. So before introducing you, James, a word on this conference in the place of nostalgia. As a nostalgia scholar that we are, James and I and others, I'm a more melancholic than nostalgic, but who is nostalgic of the season of that past? I cannot predict or fully understand nostalgia, but where the unifying and emancipatory forces of nostalgia swims, float the dangers of its abuses as dark shadows that do not share the nostalgia we have for a better future. And they might say it exactly the other way around. Extreme right-wing representatives sometimes common ground with ecologists today who wish to stop the social and climate devastation. Back to nature reminds, unfortunately, old phantoms and might be the beginning of something that has never really ended. The dangers of totalitarianism in times of crisis and false progress, where no one likes the other's nostalgia, only when it's theirs. I paraphrase Lou Reed here, the famous musician, who said once, "I don't like nostalgia unless it's mine." Interpretations of nostalgia can indeed get slippery and dangerous because it is easy to judge the other's nostalgic yearnings or longings with disrespect and ignorance. But we should not hesitate to continue to work on the current nostalgic imbrications and clashes, to not give up on nostalgia in the plural sense as a structure of feeling and acting. Epistemological differences, linguistic ones, and critical historiographies of longing are still needed and need to continue be shared widely in parallel to the homogeneous information, media, and entertainment industries. James Yékú contributes largely to these endeavors, and I welcome him therefore warmly on Zoom tonight. James Yékú is an associate professor at the University of Kansas, where he teaches African literature and digital cultures. In addition to 2 academic monographs, Yékú is the author of the poetry collections Where the Baedeker Leads and A File of Passing Memories, as well as the nonfiction collection Ambivalent Encounters and other essays. James, you also have just published a book, The Algorithmic Age of Personality, African Literature and Cancel Culture. I'm going to share it in the chat later and also with the students afterwards at the Michigan State University Press. I also going to share your website again, but normally the students have it and also the people who joined us today. And you're also a scholar interested in media and Nollywood. And the students had to read the article co-written with your author From Google Doodles to Facebook, Nostalgia and Visual Reconstruction of the Past in Nigeria in the African Studies Review. And I know that today you're going to talk a lot about Aki and Pawpaw, or Epic Run. Sorry for the pronunciation again, if it is neither my mother tongue English and I don't speak any African language. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna leave you. Can open quite soon your sharing screen and the Q&A, so the question and comments. So the students, you can send me if you have questions in the chat, and also open your microphone and camera later if you feel like that. And James, I invite you very warmly to open your screen and share your screen. I'm on two screens, so I look up and down and see if that works. Perfect. And I'm gonna hide. Yes, I think it's perfect. I just gonna hide myself now. Supprimer. Perfect. And you should be normally the one réunion. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, thanks a lot. So
thank you so very much. I appreciate your very kind words, Professor Nimaya. I want to thank you for inviting me. This is a great honor. And I'm excited to join the group of amazing students. Thank you all for saying hello virtually earlier. I appreciate that also. Great to everyone who is joining us, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions after my talk. So my goal today is basically to use digital media and cinematic forms from Nigeria to reflect on the subject of nostalgia. And I have to admit that nostalgia is a topic that is not very immediately of interest to me until recently. So I've been very much inspired by Professor Nemaya's work on that very important topic. And my sense today is to look at how it manifests in the context of Nigerian digital media cultures, Nigerian film cultures, Nollywood. My argument today is that nostalgia, despite its ambivalence, is sometimes generative and very useful in media and cultural productions. In the context of social media textualities, in which it manifests as an index of remix culture, nostalgia activates several dimensions that are oftentimes reflective, healthy, even if problematic. While I take up in this talk the more creative aspects of nostalgia in its articulation with digital media, object, and culture in Nigeria, I'll close by acknowledging its regressive potentials, hence what I refer as the ambivalent ontology of nostalgia, which reflects that of the digital media spaces in which it circulates. So in the last several years, digital media produces nostalgia as a site of post-colonial imagination in African contexts, such as Nigeria, where the film industry, Nollywood, as in the context of social media and platform culture, becomes central to the production of nostalgic longings. And this thought, therefore, I reflect on the relationship between nostalgia, digital media, and video game cultures by looking at how past cinematic assemblages become reconfigured through platform aesthetics as part of a complex memetic ecology animated by cultural information that, as Lymore Shipman argues, passes along as internet memes from person to person, but gradually scale into a shared social phenomenon. In a previous work, I have described meme culture as the most immediate and condensed mode of cultural commentary and political critiques, especially on the internet, and I've described this under the rubric of cultural netizenship. In the Nigerian, which of course is the title of my first monograph, which is on the screen. In the Nigerian framework, cultural netizenship draws extensively on Nollywood nostalgias, images, clips, and tropes from old Nollywood, the golden era of the movie industry in Nigeria. Much of my discussion today is based on Nollywood, so I really need to explain just very briefly that Nollywood is perhaps the second largest producing film industry in the world after Hollywood. It's the leading form of Nigerian popular culture, cultural productions, and it's a major dominant storytelling platform on the continent of Africa. And the talk today is based on an era of old Nollywood that goes back to the 1990s and how that particular era is re-articulated online through social media memes and recently through the Aki and Pawpaw epic run game, which I am discussing today. What I'm describing as Nollywood nostalgias, that is, a yearning for Nollywood's past, constitute an attempt to participate in the troubled manifestations of Nigerian history in a digital age. As memes, Nollywood nostalgias activates the introduction of a new generation of audiences to this classical era of Nigerian film culture. With limited employment opportunities, many in this young group come to the production of popular nostalgic forms as one mode of rehabilitating the precariousness of the economic conditions. This commodification of digital culture through the commercialization of cinematic memory and nostalgia emerges as a key element of content creation among young social media influencers and other subjects who re-signify old Nollywood images as new textual artifacts that expand the global consumption and popularity of Nigerian film cultures. And of course, that's in addition to streaming platforms like Netflix and Amazon Prime, where you can find Hollywood films today. At the same time, the creativity of this remixed culture is constrained by commercial imperatives that become crucial to understanding the performance of nostalgia on the internet. What Nehemiah and Ketley, in their study of online communities and commercially produced nostalgia, frame as, quote, the commodification of time, operate through the interconnected modes of memory and nostalgia as a way of relating to a cultural epoch. In the case of the video game Aki and Pawpaw Epic Run, which is my case study, we find other links through which the game rearticulates the relationship between Nollywood and the urban environment, especially in a city like Lagos, the economic capital of Nigeria. The representation of the Lagos cityscape in Aki and Pawpaw Epic Run explicates urbanity, as Roland Barthes argues, as an exchange site of social activities, the space in which certain subversive forces act and are encountered, forces of rupture, ludic forces. End of quote. A ludic imaginary of a city often negatively portrayed may then be understood as a special backdrop for a solid appreciation of the commodification of digital memory and nostalgia in this particularly playful context. As a nostalgia-based game, Aki and Pawpaw Epic Run can be read as re-narrating old Nollywood's of post-colonial Lagos as a place of distress, one in which modernity is unjustifiably articulated as troubled by traditional norms and values. And I will revisit this point in my closing. In the meantime, I do want to say that in addition to foregrounding the gaming and other cultural uses of Nollywood nostalgias, I'm also interested in a textual analysis of the game itself and in social media commentaries by game players. And this is with the aim of demonstrating how an array of digital forms and practices shape the circulations of nostalgia and historical memory in Nigerian digital cultures. This includes, for instance, how counter archives of historical memory circulating as ephemeral digital projects on social media shape ways of remembering the past and imagining the future. And talking about ephemeral digital projects, I do digital humanities. As a matter of fact, this is an area of scholarship and research I've been devoted to in the last 5 years. So I'm always interested in how digital media, hardware, software can be brought in conversation with different aspects of humanities questions. So if you stay with this particular section, briefly get into that discussion. The implicit in my argumentation here is how Nollywood nostalgias foster an archival imagination that recovers images from old Nigerian movies, most of which have been lost because of the lack of archival preservation. Given the willing capitulation to the forces of forgetting, described by Leila Gandhi as the mystifying amnesia of the colonial aftermath, a post-colonial setting such as in a post-colonial setting such as Nigeria, nostalgia emerges as one popular strategy by which everyday people, as cultural producers and content creators on social media, address the worrisome ahistorical sensibility of the ruling elite. The paradox here is precisely that policy-driven interventions that undermine historical education also concurrently provoke the means of their popular subversions through creative internet practices that recover a sense of history among young people online. Nostalgia as an effective repossession of past times and conditions is therefore contingent on a socio-political arrangement in which the infrastructures of memory making, absent and constantly endangered by state inactions, allow us to retrieve alternative forms of remembering the past. Although social media is less of an archive than a connective space to share information and engage in conversations, and of course, both of these are vulnerable to the logics of platform capitalism. I believe that groups such as the Nigerian Nostalgia Project, which is the focus of the article some of you may have read, these groups use social networks as avenues for recovering the past. And for those in the audience who might not be familiar with the NNP, the NNP Nigerian Nostalgia Project is a crowdsourced social media community. You can find them on Facebook, Twitter, and different places. And what they do is to collect images, videos, and sound bites just to introduce people to Nigerian history and encourage historical conversations around the country, about the country and from different parts of the country. The labor of memory making performed by groups like the NNP relies on a productive understanding of nostalgia. This is one sense of nostalgia that is not regressive or necessarily negative. In examining how digital platforms like Facebook are engaged to share and discuss historical photographs and shape collective memories on the NNP, nostalgia can be seen as central to the understanding of the ways in which digital media transforms engagement with the Nigerian past. So the point is that the way people understand Nigerian history is greatly transformed today, and digital media is central to that. And the NNP itself helps us understand that transformation. Through an enactment of a politics of resistance to official forgetfulness, what private member initiatives such as the NNP manifest is a digital archival response to the gaps and absences of memory, with nostalgia performed digitally through videos, photos, and sound bites as a way of imagining the Nigerian past. But these kinds of digital labor are in fact not restricted to the realm of preservationist initiatives. They also draw very significantly from other, sometimes older media texts and objects. And here I have in mind, and this is central to the argument I'm developing, how nostalgia is expressed in the context of film reproduction and the remakes of past Nollywood classics. I have a couple of examples of these on the screen. And also the mediatized resignifications of movie signs and quotes by content creators on digital social media's internet memes. Sorry, I have my 2-year-old trying to come in and playing with the doll. Okay. So at this point, I'd like to turn briefly to the relations between Nollywood and social media memes, and how both of these combine to shape the affective longings for a past cultural era in Nigeria. My goal here is to argue that intermediate connections between filmic and game tests can be leveraged to appreciate the unruly expressions and uses of nostalgia in the context of Nigerian popular aesthetics and their articulations with digital media cultures. Rather than solely focusing on principles of narrative adaptation and remediations between film and video games, the major stake of my analysis is the manifestations of these connections as engine or as dependent on creative renegotiations of nostalgia within platform cultural productions. At the same time, we are reminded of the distinctions often put forward by scholars of Nollywood studies, especially distinctions between old Nollywood and new Nollywood in terms of storytelling and modes of production and distribution. So the main point of departure between both is that old Nollywood films were shot straight to video VHS cassettes. They emerged from a post-celluloid tradition and basically films of low quality production, unlike new Nollywood today that you find on streaming platforms. You find if you go to the cinemas, you have them available, and of course these films. You find them at the cinemas, and of course you have films that are more aesthetically complex and sophisticated, both in terms of cinematography and storytelling. For Nollywood scholar Morade Adejumobi, old Nollywood is marked by the aesthetic representation of modernity and temporality, in which hustling, desire for wealth and economic freedom lead protagonists into the grip of forces aligned with, and I'm quoting Adejumobi here. Excuse me 1 minute, please. I'll just get my toddler.
Your toddler can join. It's never too early to join university endeavors.
Could you please take him to the room? Thank you. Sorry about that.
No, you don't have to be sorry. We all have a life besides Zoom.
So to quote Morade Adejumobi, old Nollywood is marked by the aesthetic representation of modernity and temporality, in which hustling, desire for wealth and economic freedom lead protagonists into the grip of forces aligned with an always malevolent inclination of tradition, which then deprives them of access to the expected benefits of modernity. End of quote. On the other hand, the most visible markers of new Nollywood are innovative and sophisticated cinematography, as well as a return to movie theaters, and also this avoidance of the straight-to-video formats and moral panic that characterize old Nollywood films. But we also know that new Nollywood and old Nollywood exhibit historical connections that demonstrate the overlaps in both media forms, with both having the capacity to produce Nollywood nostalgias. But there's also, I argue, a heterotopic connection to the flourishing of Nollywood nostalgias on social media, particularly when understood through practices of cultural netizenship that are often contingent on the strategic redeployment of other visual forms. So although much of content creation online depends on the original production of new cultural texts, it also relies on remixing other images and artifacts, narratives, whether from the digital present or the analog past. With old Nollywood images constituting an aesthetic practice of reuse, therefore, content creators revive and reproduce past cinematic forms as a site of new textualities. Matter, as in why does the circulation of old Nollywood as memes of remembering and also means of remembering, playing on the word meme, memes of remembering and means of remembering. Why does old Nollywood in that formulation, why does it matter? I think one way to think about that is to recall Yossi Parika's argument about the transformation in the protocols of cultural remembering. Parika argues that the labor of how culture remembers and retrieves from memory is shifting from the official institutions to everyday media environments, social media, or more generally, the way in which data are transmitted and stored, even if fleetingly. In a place like Nigeria, and in the absence of such official archives and institutions of memory, film remakes, social media images and memes, as well as video games, all of which nostalgically reconstruct the past, become one of several ways the contemporary culture in the country recovers and remembers the past. In the sense elaborated by Bolton and Grossen, the production of nostalgia in the game I shall discuss very shortly is conspicuously based on quote, a double logic of remediation, since Aki and Pawpaw Epic Run, the game, is based on social media memes, which themselves are textual revisions of old Nollywood aesthetics and images. So the point is how memes recontextualize old Nollywood, and that's what I would argue we need to keep in mind. And I previously termed this process the memification of Nollywood, to stress out the intermediate convergence between old Nollywood films and social media manifest through memes, reaction gifs, and other visual aesthetics, and is rooted in nostalgia, functioning as a form of cultural netizenship. Cultural netizenship is my way of describing the platformization of popular culture, basically, just to think about, for instance, how the President of the United States bombs protesters in the US, or how the Chinese government might create an AI song to mock tariffs from the US. It just, the cat meme as a site of aesthetic possibility. To summarize the points I've made so far, an acute nostalgia for the golden era of Nollywood, or for old Nollywood movies, started online from the 2010s when social media content creators began sharing memes from Nollywood classics and monetizing them in a way that demonstrates platform cultural productions as one strategy of escaping the precarious realities of widespread youth unemployment. In the same way as film remakes can be understood as industrial products deeply rooted in the material conditions of commercial filmmaking, these internet memes can be seen as object of an algorithmically driven and extractivist cultural industry that ambivalently makes possible some forms of narrative and economic agency. Is this idea that the internet, or social media in particular, can enable and also depoliticize in many ways. The fact of nostalgia's commodification in different social media contexts suggests that as media consumers look back, what is operationalized is an entrepreneurial excavation of old Nollywood. That means, for example, people wear images of Nigerian films as part of their everyday sartorial options. This commercial orientation aside, the cultural function of Nollywood nostalgia is important because as playful counter archives of historical memory, Nollywood memes may circulate as ephemeral digital projects on social media, but they also shape how a new generation of people digitally remember the past, imagine other temporalities, and perform nostalgia through the sharing of past movie clips. I shall now proceed to the last section of this talk, demonstrating how Aki and Pawpaw epic run recenters not just characters from old Nollywood, but rearticulates some of the most recurrent subject fascinations of that era of Nollywood storytelling. The medium may be different, but the thematic and aesthetic codes are trenchantly reminiscent of old Nollywood. So let's discuss the game itself. On the 27th of April, 2 years ago, 2023, a Nollywood director tweeted the words, "Say hello to the first Nollywood app," the first Nollywood game app. Tweeted those words to his followers, announcing the official launch of Aki and Pawpaw Epic Run, a 4D game published by Play Network Studios and appearing on Google Play Store as, quote, an epic, endless running game. As a Nollywood-derived video game, Aki and Pawpaw Epic Run is therefore the most recent and symbolic iteration of the nostalgic principle in Nigerian social media cultures. And what I've tracked so far is to talk about how groups like the Nigerian Nostalgia Project recovers past images of Nigeria, posts them on social media as an archival intervention, and how people share memes from old past Nollywood movies as whether for economic, as to create content and monetize content. And the game becomes the most recent iteration of all of those kind of possibilities. And it is based on Nollywood nostalgias that exhibits two famous diminutive Nigerian actors, Osita Iheme and Chinedu Ikedeze, who often play children characters in Nollywood films from the 2000s, and whose past clips and images vitalize Nigerian meme culture in the present. In the case of these two characters, nostalgia plays a vivid role as the animating element in their re-articulation online, first as social media meme and later as game characters that enact the convergence of past and present socio-political meanings. Building on the distinction between media nostalgia, seen as how re-experiencing an unchanged media content can trigger nostalgia and past memories, and mediated nostalgia, in which media serves mainly as a portal to a person's media unrelated experiences from their past. Bowman and Wolf identify nostalgia as a motivator for gaming, something that appears to be the case with Aki and Pawpaw Epic Run, given the social media commentary on it. As a matter of fact, a post from 2023 when the game was released mentions Aki and Pawpaw as milking our nostalgia, and this is quoting from a social media comment on the game, and we can linger on that on this particular statement to think about the economic undercurrent, but I'm more interested for now in how nostalgia motivates, why people play and why the game was made in the first place. Based on other running games like Temple Run and Subway Surf, gamers are invited to join Aki and Pawpaw on their thrilling adventure across captivating worlds, in which they have to dodge obstacles, collect power-ups, and unlock amazing characters, while swiping in different directions and ducking under to overcome challenges throughout the duration of gameplay. As gamers encounter different forces that hinder their escape, they run to avoid even more assailants, including street vendors and hoodlums, and a masquerade, all portrayed as hardships and difficulties that push them to run. The most obvious element of the game is its incorporation of nostalgia again, since the makers leverage the immense popularity of Aki and Pawpaw, first as old Nollywood characters, and then in recent years as Nollywood-derived memes on social media, using them to create connections with film consumers. But what may be less obvious is how the game and its aesthetics significantly restage the cultural codes of Nigerian film culture itself, especially through a completely distinct and unrelated media form, and at the same time how the game enacts Nollywood's cultural and representational politics at the level of its social spatial politics and subject matter. And here my interest is to just focus a bit on how the game mimics old Nollywood's representation of the city space. So besides its anchorage on Nollywood nostalgia, Aki and Pawpaw Epic Run's well-established and addictive endless runner format might be appealing to audiences, but the very idea of running away from obstacles in Lagos is itself potentially problematic, if not revealing. Although the game incorporates elements of the quotidian life in Lagos, such as its popular buses and motorcycles, its transport infrastructure system, and its widely spoken pidgin English, these distinctive elements serve to present the city and its landscape negatively in the game, recruiting nostalgia to supplement its problematic media science and ideologies. For example, the runner who escapes obstacles and gains points from the ability to avoid urban troubles and hindrances metaphorizes a politics of cityscapes that projects post-colonial urbanities as locations of endemic misery. The suggestion of the game is that of something nefarious in Lagos that keeps people endlessly running and panting to attain respite and sanity. Yet this aesthetic choice of Lagos as a place of hellish contradictions re-echoes trite scholarly accounts of the African city as a place of deviance and abnormality, an emblem of irresolvable crisis. With the Lagos cityscape portrayed as a hellscape in this sense, the game reinforces the vertical view of the city that informed the approach to Lagos in the work of the Dutch architect and theorist Rem Koolhaas, who sought to study Lagos from the elevated height of a roving helicopter rather than go to the city. He stayed from the helicopter and just tried to understand the urban environment over there. For Koolhaas, Lagos possesses an aura of apocalyptic violence, with many parts and entire sections smoldering as if it were one gigantic rubbish dump. And these are the words these are words from Koolhaas's work. Yet this negative view, and indeed the game's troubling view of Lagos, something that is also common in old Nollywood films, is countered by contemporary Nollywood films, including film remakes of Nollywood classics that offer a more balanced, positive yet unromanticized image of Lagos. If you go on Netflix today and look for Nollywood films, you'll find images of the city that attempt specifically to project a more positive and healthy image of the country. More like new Nollywood movies offer a redemptive view of Lagos, unlike the very stereotypic views you have from old Nollywood, and which this particular game reproduces. The game's aesthetic therefore puts gamers in a position to interact with the built environment in Lagos in a manner that conjures up apocalyptic visions of the post-colonial city as a dystopian world of fears and apprehensions, as it were an exchange site of post-colonial disenchantment. While gamers proudly identify with beloved characters from a past era of Nigerian film culture, they are at the same time made to perform nostalgia in the game environment in a troubled space. A nostalgia-based game narrative is the means, therefore, by which the game makers creatively narrate post-colonial Lagos as a place of distress, a space to run away from in order to apprehend the future of better opportunities. The game draws on memories and images of old Nollywood to enable gamers to imagine a present without constraint and a future of economic possibilities. Hence, the game narrative, while important for going beyond the film medium to make legible the connections between African urbanities and game worlds, situate nostalgia in an affective cartography in which a yearning for the past is made explicit in a geography of chaos and a geography of flight. While it may be the case that most video landscapes are actually largely characterized by dystopian sensibilities and anxieties, and the research on video games and the urban space usually focuses on this idea of dystopias characterizing the built environment. So while that may be the case, the negative representation of the Lagos urban space in a Nollywood-themed game paradoxically flattens a much more complex relationship between Nollywood and Lagos, both of which shape the images and perception of each other. This relationship between Nollywood and Lagos enables us to understand the city as constituting an archive of tropes through which the historical evolution of city life is represented. At a microscopic level, therefore, the game may be understood as a remediation of tropes about Lagos, with nostalgia employed through its different aesthetics as the locus of the narrative and gameplay, with Nollywood representing a crucial sense of dissensus, one that reframes what can and must be said about urban life in West Africa today. The remediation of its aesthetics through the video game expands the discursive connections to Lagos. So if past photographic images of Lagos as a clean and organized space occasionally circulate on social media through groups such as the Nigerian Nostalgia Project, or even through Aki and Pawpaw, on the other hand, appears reluctant to replicate that strategy, limiting its element of nostalgia mainly to game elements like characterization and narrative itself. But that performance element is also evident in the game, just like you find on the NNP forum. Unlike the NNP, though, on which nostalgia is a performative means by which members of the NNP self-fashion themselves as people who possess historical knowledge and use visual forms to long for a past era. Unlike this particular scenario, the engagement with pastness in the game occurs at the level of a repetitive and processual ludic experience that suggests gameplay as performative activity. The runner format, understood through the standpoint of economic hustling, is reminiscent of old Nollywood in many ways, particularly the ways in which its neoliberal rationalities are pretexts for the production of the modern subjects, whose material aspirations, as Adejumobi argues, are undermined by forces aligned with a distorted image of indigenous values and a malicious representation of tradition. The point is not merely that the game fails to redeem old Nollywood's stereotypical portrayal of the tension between tradition and modernity. It's that its subject matter is organized around a consolidated misperception of traditional forms as decidedly evil, backward, and constitutive of crisis in a dysfunctional Lagos megacity. This is a nostalgia paradox, I argue, which means the way the game is dealing with the past puts a more regressive nostalgia into the forefront than a reflective or creative one. Or put differently, a regressive logic characterizes the game's reflective and creative appropriation of nostalgia. Hence, the game's ontological, intermedial, and thematic focus is constrained largely by ambivalence. And the masquerade from which the character runs is an example of this idea, and I'm beginning this together. A significant symbol of African religious traditions and cultural performances. The masquerade in the game is problematically represented as a danger from which people must flee, a problem that hinders and undermines modern subjectivities. The fact that this demonization of indigenous values and aesthetics is fundamental to the game's plot and meanings is another way by which the game mimics old Nollywood and its storytelling patterns. Viewed through this standpoint of its focus on regressive nostalgia, more important for the current analysis is the correlation of the masquerade's mischaracterization to the notions of ancestral memory, which it signifies in many indigenous and African cultural spaces. Ancestral memory describes memories that are passed down from a past generation to the present, especially from ancestors that are long dead. Through the masquerade tradition, a vital location of ancestral remembering and narratives in many cultures around the world, the past becomes legible in the present, embodied through actors, often with elaborate masking and costuming in festival contests, would transfer knowledge and experiences from the past to interpret the present. If memory as the unending work of selfhood entails bringing our memories at par with the memories of others who matter to us, and yeah, I'm quoting the scholar Vanessa May, then we may read ancestral memory as calling individuals to align their memories with those of ancestors who, though belonging from a very far ethereal distance, continue to shape the present because they matter to them and their culture's protocols of remembering the past. This is where you might find the contradictory logics of this particular game. In its aesthetic uses and repurposing of Nollywood nostalgias, its narrative is based on the disapprobation of ancestral memory. Hence, the game's nostalgic revival of a cinematic past is contingent on the erasure of the present embodiment of another pastness, an ancestral time it repudiates as evil. As gamers choose from an array of celebrity figures and notably Nollywood's Aki and Pawpaw to escape from the fabricated infernos of the Lagos simulacrum in the game, one of their main tasks is to maneuver themselves out of the temporal geographies of ancestrality. At the same time, although the game characters may be running away from ancestral presence and memories, the masquerade remains an indelible feature of every gameplay, reavowing the persistence of ancestral memories in African and indigenous spaces and cultures. And before I begin to bore people, I like to begin to summarize and just, wrap things up. The point I've tried to make is that Nollywood and platform cultural productions may be the dominant avenues for popular entertainment in contemporary Nigeria, but game playing emerges as one symbolic and media form that expands the aesthetic scope and political economic calculus of the current popular cultural landscape. As a digital media form, its connections to Nollywood storytelling compels analysis that show how the film medium can be made creatively entangled with other media forms. If you go to South Africa, and South Africa offers a very solid, a rare an exceptional situation in terms of the video game industry on the continent, right? South Africa and probably a couple of countries in North Africa, and perhaps Kenya and Nigeria having some kind of video game industries. But this is not an industry that is well established, and you don't have you have a lot of gamers in these countries, but the games are mostly from the West, right? But with Aki and Pawpaw, what you have is a game that draws from an indigenous and local creative industry, and I find that very fascinating, especially as it engages with the notion of nostalgia. Aki and Pawpaw Epicron present the affective revival of past cultural forms as fundamental to the process of digitally remembering and its praxis of artistic and archival engagement. But nostalgia in Aki and Pawpaw Epicron also signals how new aesthetic uses of old Nollywood in digital environments enact genealogies of media assemblages as relations of incorporation and transformation. While the game revives, cite, and represent old Nollywood subjectivities at the level of form and storytelling, it also significantly transforms these elements, recasting actors like Aki and Pawpaw's animations, for example, while valuing the complex relationships between digital media practices and urban realities. In Nigeria, the relationship between the film industry, Nollywood, and African cities like Lagos may be well established, but not much scholarly work exists on the ways in which ludic narratives and video games in particular, whether drawing on affective longings for the past or not, shape the mediatized representations of the African city. The point I'm making is that the African city is almost absent in game narratives because game narratives themselves are not very, ubiquitous. Although I've sought to demonstrate these links and correlation, my main focus has been to track other points of imbrication, including how Nollywood nostalgias are incorporated into digital storytelling like the video game form. To fully appreciate the Nigerian meme sphere, to return to Nollywood memes now, as a digital vernacular of everyday online communication, or as what Lauren Balland calls silly objects of everyday online communication, nostalgia-driven analysis of the citations and revival of old Nollywood images in video games and other spaces become generative for us, just thinking along those lines. The on-screen performances of Nollywood actors are expanded through memes and games, which offer another kind of digital performance that changes the consumption of film. As evident in the video game examined, and indeed in social media memes themselves, at the core of this intermediate connection is nostalgia, functioning as a major affective index of engaging with past cinematic subjects and images. Aki and Pawpaw may still be with us today in Nollywood, but it is their past works from old Nollywood rather than the new Nollywood that make people identify with them as social media memes and video game characters. The point is that the characters that produce Aki and Pawpaw are still very much, in the industry. You still find them in films, but it is the films and movies from the 90s and the 2000s especially that make people identify with, even in these new Nollywood movies or as social media memes on Twitter and Facebook. In other words, their retextualization as internet memes and in this game as video game characters succeed largely because of a popular longing for a cinematic past, which, though technologically unsophisticated, continues to shape the present and affect the culture. I think that's all I have. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time. Looking forward to your questions and comments.
Merci, James. Thank you very much. Are you fine with stopping sharing your screen?
Yes.
Okay.